Chapter 26. What do you mean by crisis of conscience? Rain asked, not fully understanding his meaning. She was confused and uneasy, becoming more so by the moment. I'm trying to explain that I need to be sure you're here with me now for the right reasons, not the wrong ones. Until this morning, I didn't know you were that close with your deceased father, and that his death affected you more than it did your brother, and you're feeling a little lost and alone. On top of that, you're faced with the burden of trying to run his business. You're worried, and you're scared. All those emotions may be clouding your judgment about what you and I are doing. He paused for some response from her. Wary of saying anything, Rain simply nodded that she understood, even though she didn't. Not completely. Not yet. Until an hour ago, he continued, I thought your boyfriend was some middle-aged jerk who didn't care about you enough to stay with you. Are you following me so far? Rain nodded slowly. Good. Then here's the reality. In Zen, there's an eligible man who wants to marry you. Here, in this room, there's a man who wants to make crazy love to you until neither of us has the strength to move anymore. But it can't go any further than that. It would get much too intricate for me and my life. And you don't like intricacies? No, Liam said, especially not the kind that would follow if you think for a moment there would be anything else between us other than this. Rain's heart sank. I'm glad you told me this, she said, struggling to view her unfortunate situation unemotionally, without feeling mortified that she'd let herself land in this embarrassing, degrading situation in the first place. Viewed from the right perspective, she knew she was better off finding out now, rather than later, that Liam's only interest in her was as a brief, convenient partner for a little fun sex. Now that she understood, she also knew she would end up feeling guilty and disgusted with herself for betraying Max for something as cheap and meaningless as what Liam was shamelessly suggesting. Furthermore, Liam's summation of her state of mind was probably right. She was an emotional mess over her father, and she wasn't thinking rationally. Because if she was thinking rationally, she would never have agreed to even take Liam to dinner last night. Thankfully, Liam was thinking very rationally and behaving very honorably by letting her know how he felt. And to give him even more credit, he wasn't pressuring her to settle for what he was offering her, either. Quite the opposite, in fact. Having arrived at these conclusions, Rain felt truly relieved and clear-headed, and, somewhere deep inside of her, painfully disappointed and wretched. For the moment, however, there was nothing she could do except try to be calm and good-natured, and then deal with the mental turmoil later, when she was alone in her room, away from Liam Thompson. You were right when you said I'm overly emotional these days because of my father's death, and my judgment isn't from a clear mind, as well. Even as she said that, Rain's instincts and her heart insisted that although she may have been wrong about everything else, there was something special about the connection she felt with him, and that he felt it, too. She decided to take a small risk and lay that all out for him. There was nothing he could do but make fun of her, and she didn't think he would do that from what she'd come to know of him. Raising her eyes to his, she said softly, I think fate may have intended for us to meet yesterday and get to know each other better, that it was predestined. The instant she said, predestined, he gave her a skeptical look, leaned his shoulder against the window, and folded his arms over his chest. His body language was a clear, eloquent reflection of any supernatural influences being involved, but Rain didn't want him to mock her theory before he understood it. I know this might sound crazy, but I think I like you very much, she persevered quietly, and I think you like me, too. It's not crazy. I do. I like you very much, too, he admitted with a sudden smile that was warm and genuine and made Rain's treacherous heart skip a beat. That's what I meant when I referred to fate and predestination. I'm usually slow and cautious about liking someone, and I was really hell-bound on disliking you before. Why? He said so suddenly that his displeased expression made Rain chuckle against her will. Have you ever tried to see yourself from another woman's perspective, or ever taken a good look at your face in the mirror? He touched his face and looked at her questioningly, like he had no idea what she meant and why she disliked him in the past for his face. I disliked you because you were always with different women, and you have a good-looking face for a man. I disliked you because I never really cared to know the real you before I judged you. Out of words and explanations, Rain gave him the only actual example she could think of. The best way I can make you understand what I've been trying to say is this. Holding her hands out, palms up, she smiled wryly and said, Look at us now. We're in a hotel room, our topic is sex, and we're discussing it as if we've been friends forever. Without any anger or pretense, You've made me realize I would be making a big mistake if I go to bed with you. Finished, Rain waited for him to agree. With eyes narrowed in thought, he nodded slowly as if he was arriving at a conclusion that surprised and somewhat displeased him. That's what we've been deciding? Since he seemed to be asking himself that question, Rain saw no reason to answer it. Furthermore, it was an odd question under the circumstances, and she was running low on clever, rational answers. Instead of replying, she stood up and strolled over to the balcony doors. Now, since I haven't cheated on my boyfriend, she said lightly, and neither of us has done anything we'll regret later, why don't we do what two new friends should do on such a gorgeous island? Let's go sightseeing, she suggested, trying to mask her hurt with an excitement she wasn't feeling. When I'm back in Zen and you're, wherever you are, we can exchange numbers and call each other, and talk about things like, remember that charming little eatery in Maranta? After we're done sightseeing, you can drop me off at the vet's office, if you wouldn't mind. I'll pick up Eric and take him back to the island club and wait for Max to return tomorrow. When Liam didn't reply after several moments, Rain glanced over her shoulder and saw that he hadn't moved an inch from his earlier position. He was still standing with his shoulder propped against the window and his arms folded over his chest. Only now, he was looking at her with his brows drawn together. She studied his handsome, flawless features and could not make out even a hint of what he was thinking. Can I ask you something? She said hesitantly. He nodded. Unable to meet his gaze while she asked her question, Rain turned back toward the balcony, absently rubbing her arms. Are you disappointed that there was no real connection between us last night? That it was just the setting and the moment? When he didn't immediately answer, she flicked a glance over her shoulder. No longer looking at her, he had tipped his head slightly down and to his right, as if he were studying the carpet. No, he said curtly. Then he lifted his head and looked straight at her. No, he repeated more confidentially. A realization hit Rain like a physical shock from an electrical pole. As clearly as if he'd said it to her, she knew it was true, and surprise made her turn fully toward him. You really didn't feel the magical connection I felt last night, did you? No, I didn't. You used the term, magic, to describe last night. I didn't, he said as he straightened from his lounging position. Strolling toward her, he gave her an impatient lecture on his reality. I do not believe in predestination, soulmates, or magical connections. I also do not believe in miracles, spells, or witchcraft. But they are real, Rain tried to argue. Some of the tension went out of his face at her words. You don't really believe in that garbage, do you? The disappointment Rain felt earlier was turning to hurt because she now realized he was pleased with their situation today and even purposely causing it to some extent. Why was she even trying to force him to see what, in his own reality, didn't exist? Was she so desperate for attention that she was forcing him to see that they were meant for each other? He had made it clear that he wanted nothing from her but a casual fling, and that part hurt more than she wanted it to. She'd known from the beginning that Liam Thompson could never keep a woman because he had feelings for her. Studies had shown and proven that men who carry and change lovers often would never have the ability to form an attachment with one person, but she'd silently hoped for more. Struggling to keep her tone neutral and not show him any of her emotions, she said, At this point, it no longer matters what I believe. Pretend it does, he said. All right, I believe in them. I don't know what magic is or how a soulmate bond works, but I felt it last night with you. I'm willing to agree that you weren't the cause of it, but... He cut her off with a mocking laugh. I suppose you're going to try to convince me you felt this magical connection with your boyfriend and that you were in a relationship with him because of that? It was like a bucket of cold water was doused over her head at his mocking words. She sobered immediately. Clenching her fists, she said, First of all, I'm not trying to convince you of anything. Second, if the answer to your question was yes, I wouldn't have been with you last night, and I wouldn't be here now. Third, and most important of all, don't you ever mention him again, she warned angrily. You have no right to discuss him nor make fun of him. It was this first-time defense of the boyfriend that warned Liam he had now run out of rope with her, and he was standing close to the edge of a dangerous brink. She had too much pride and self-respect to settle for what little he was willing to offer. She wanted something more, and without it, she was staying faithful to her boyfriend. In fact, her mind was already made up to stay with him. What matters, she continued in a calm, apologetic voice as she unknowingly shoved him clear off the brink, is that you refuse to believe in what I believe in, and I refuse not to believe in it. And therein lies the gap we can't bridge. Not in this room or anywhere else. Liam felt himself plunging through thin air, sent over the edge by a beautiful young redhead with the face of an angel. Even so, he made a manful attempt to gain a foothold and stop his fall by suggesting, "Why don't we go to bed and see what happens there?" She shook her head and smiled that mature smile of hers. "Why? So I could try to make you feel the connection while you try to prove there is none? One person can't make that kind of connection. It takes two. It's inevitable that you'd succeed and I'd end up being disappointed. If I'm going to be disappointed," she admitted in a gentle tone, "I don't want it to happen with you. I don't know why, but I don't want to have another reason to dislike you now that I know the real you." She turned away and stepped through the balcony doorway, looking out at the water. "Let's go sightseeing now and try to get to know each other as friends before I pick up Eric and take him back with me. I'll wait out here if you'd like to change clothes." Liam experienced the full force of his renewed free fall, complete with sensations of his stomach twisting into knots and wind howling in his ears. Drawing a long, steadying breath, he gazed at the slender back of the woman he'd allowed to do this to him, to mess with his emotions and mind. And his balance returned, he felt the floor beneath his feet. On the balcony was an exquisite young woman who touched his heart, overheated his blood, and made him do things he would normally not do. She was passionate and sweet, honest and unpredictable. She smiled like an angel, and was kind enough to adopt an ugly, stray dog with fleas. She was magic. And he was completely enchanted by her. Walking up behind her, he slid his arms around her and drew her back against his chest. "Let's get involved, Rain," he said with desperation in his voice. Chapter 27. Walking up behind her, he slid his arms around her and drew her back against his chest. "Let's get involved, Rain," he said with desperation in his voice. "Thanks for the offer," she said politely, "but I'm no longer interested in cheating on my boyfriend. It's better to leave things just as they are." She tried to move away from his hold, but he tightened his grip on her to keep her still. Ignoring her little struggles to free herself from him, Liam pressed his lips to the top of her head and whispered, "Chant your incantations and put me under your spell, lovely witch, but don't push me away like that again." He didn't know what he was doing, but the fact that she had defended her boyfriend a while ago made him feel like she'd put a barricade between them and was setting boundaries that wouldn't be crossed again if he agreed to settle for just being her friend. As she continued to struggle against his hold without listening, he leaned down and whispered, "Say something, little red," then lightly pressed his teeth against her earlobe. Rain felt a shiver down her spine and knew she was falling into his seductive trap. "Please stop this, or we won't end up being friends after all," she warned, sounding a little breathless. "We're already friends," he murmured, trailing his mouth to her ear and his hand to her breast. "We're about to become lovers." She stiffened at the touch of his hand against her breast, but refused to relent and swat his hand away. "That is so disrespectful of you, Mr. Thompson. I told you, I don't want to get involved with you anymore. Now let go of me," she warned. "Yes, you do, and so do I," he said, and swirled her around and kissed the side of her lips. "Put your arms around me and wrap us up in that magical connection of last night. I can't do it without you." "Oh, for heaven's sake," she burst out. "What do you think you're?" Liam switched from tender persuasion to assertive action and clamped his hand over her mouth before she could finish. "Rain," he warned in a low, deep voice, "for the next hour, the only sounds I want to hear from your mouth are moans of delight and the words, 'yes,' 'more,' and 'please.'" He lifted his hand a fraction of an inch, and she said, "Stop it." Wrong words. Green eyes, wary and annoyed, flared at him from beneath graceful russet brows drawn into a dark, warning frown. Liam heeded her expression and carefully softened his tone. "I am trying to surrender. The truth is that I felt all the same things you did last night, and you know I did." Looking into his dark eyes, listening to the slightly husky timbre of his baritone voice, Rain sensed that he was telling her the truth as well as allowing her a glimpse beneath another one of his many layers, and she felt a sharp tug on her heart even though she wanted to end everything here and go back to Max. His next explanation was just as surprising. "The discouraging things I said to you a few minutes ago were mostly because I was trying, in a half-hearted way, to protect you from me." He paused, tilted his head to the side, and after a moment's thought, he added, "Actually, it might have been the other way around." Rain, trying hard not to fall for him again so soon, bit her lip and quickly looked away to his shoulder, but it didn't help. She was so irresistibly drawn to him that there was no escape. Marveling at her own helplessness, she shook her head a little. Liam evidently mistook that shake of her head as an indication that she was about to reject what he'd said, and he gave her a stern warning. Number is not on the list I gave you of acceptable words. Rain knew she would be betraying herself if she still refused to accept defeat and get involved with Liam Thompson. She was already trying her best to pretend she didn't want anything with him again. And so she succumbed to defeat. Looking into his ebony eyes, she laid her palms on his chest and softly whispered a word that was not on his list. Liam. She saw pleasure flicker in his eyes when she said his name that way. You may add that word to your list. Leaning up on her toes, eyes shining with passion, voice shaky with awakening desire, Rain twined her arms around his neck. Please, she whispered, her lips almost touching his. An excellent choice, Liam decreed, and brushed his lips back and forth over hers in a light, teasing kiss. More, Rain murmured when he lifted his mouth from hers. An even better choice, Liam said with a grin, gathering her tightly into his arms, preparing to slowly savor and explore her mouth. He turned his head to the side and fit his mouth to hers, his tongue plunging in and out in a slow, wet kiss that left a trail of saliva as he moved his lips back and forth over hers. She moaned in pleasure as he deepened the kiss, his hands moving up and down the sides of her breasts. Unable to handle the intense heat that exploded in the pit of her stomach, she arched her hips against his rigid erection, surprised to feel his hardened, bulging member pressing against her. Her action caused a hungry groan to tear from Liam's throat, raw hunger consuming him. He maneuvered her, without resistance, to the side of the bed and let her go while he pulled his shirt off. When he dropped it to the floor and reached out to help take her shirt off, she smiled up at him and shook her head slightly as if she wanted to do it herself for him. She caught the hem of her top, and drew it up and over her head. When she finished, she stood in front of him in a black lacy bra, and Liam found himself smiling back at her, a warm, playful smile tinged with a challenge. He dropped his gaze from her green eyes, and his hands went to his belt. Rain had to take off her sneakers before she could step out of her jeans, so she bent to deal with them. In front of her lowered eyes, his pants and briefs hit the floor. With shaky fingers, Rain concentrated on unfastening one sneaker, then the other. She stepped out of them and started to straighten. Partway up, her gaze slid up a rigid male member, and she hastily jerked her eyes away. Looking at that magnificent chest of his was less nerve-wracking than seeing him naked at the hips for the first time. His hands went to her shoulders, his thumbs pulling her bra straps down, leaving them loose on her arms, before he slid his hands around her back and unhooked her bra with the ease of a man who had unhooked many. Thinking that, she raised her gaze to his and saw a knowing expression sweep across his face, before he lowered his eyelids and pulled her bra away from her breasts and down her arms. Rain stepped out of her jeans, and his slow, languorous gaze drifted boldly over her, examining her breasts and waist and belly, then down between her thighs. In the way that she often sensed what he was thinking, she knew he expected her to put him through the same appraisal, but although she was ready to touch and be touched, she wasn't quite ready to take a deliberate look at what she'd seen unintentionally moments before. She hadn't meant to look at his male member, but the view of it was so vivid that she'd gotten to see how fully male he was. His voice was deep and sure as his hand finally reached toward her, but not for any of the places she expected him to want to touch. His hand settled under her chin, tipping it up. "Are you shy?" he asked. She met his gaze unflinchingly and said, "No, just a little. Uncertain." He mistook her meaning. "Don't even consider uncertainty when we've come this far," he warned. Rain bit her lip to hide her smile, laid her palms against the muscles of his chest, and, while his hands settled on her waist, she exerted pressure. She slid her hands slowly up over his nipples, and then spread her fingers and slid them slowly back down while she watched the banked fires in his eyes begin to smolder. "Not that kind of uncertain," she whispered back. They stood naked, face to face. She had beautiful breasts, not large, but full, and as he trailed his hand up from her waist towards her breast, his eyelids closed with pleasure at the sensation of her skin. At her nipple, he opened his fingers and captured it. He increased the pressure until he wrung the first gasp of pleasure out of her. Her hands glided over his shoulders, while she covered his mouth with her soft lips and brought her body into full contact with his. The lazy pleasure of moments ago exploded in a flood of pure lust, and Liam wrapped his arms around her and twisted his body, sending them back onto the bed. His hardened member landed directly between her thighs, and his hands shifted back to her breasts. She gazed at him, sultry and playful, eyes smiling warmly into his. He couldn't believe how much intimate pleasure he felt just watching her face and knowing she was watching his. Her hands smoothed slowly over his back and down his buttocks, holding him tight to her. She opened her legs, and he reminded himself that this was too soon, the foreplay having barely begun. But he let his body touch the entrance to hers, experiencing the delight of finding her already wet and ready to take him in. He edged inside of her just an inch, smiling a little at her hazy expression. He moved his hands to her hair. He shoved his fingers into it and, lowering his mouth to hers, slowly, deliberately forced her lips to part, opening them wide, while his hips lifted and forced her to open wide. He intended to ease just a little deeper into that tight, enclosing warmth, except that just then, she tightened her hands on his buttocks, arched her hips as much as his heavy weight would allow, and whispered an aching, "Please." He drew back, deliberately resisting the invitation. "Please," she whispered again while arching her hips deep into his, and Liam lost control against his will. He rammed himself into her, burying himself full length into her arching body, and his own body began to move without his volition, capturing her and forcing her to move with him. With the last ounce of willpower he possessed, he rolled onto his back, putting her astride his hips to slow them both down before everything would end so fast. Pressing her palms against him for support, she forced herself into a sitting position, her rumpled hair falling down her sides and over her breasts. The sight of her was pure art to Liam: pale, flushed skin, dark red hair cascading all over her, and desire-filled eyes that made him know without a doubt that he would never forget this day nor the beautiful woman atop him. Never. She began to move on him with a rhythm that became a part of his breathing, of the coursing of blood through his veins. He could have continued pleasuring her by forcing his body higher into hers, except that she lifted her head and gazed straight into his eyes, looking as aroused as he was but a little baffled. "Take your time," he whispered, an act of almost suicidal unselfishness given the urgent state of his body. Her answer explained the bafflement in her green eyes. "I can't," she whispered, and with a groan of anticipation and defeat, Liam tossed her onto her back and began driving into her with long, deep, slow strokes. She clasped him to her and buried her face in the curve of his neck, her fingers biting into his back, her body straining and moving with his. She cried out and clung to him tighter while spasms rocked her, and Liam slammed forward, climaxing with her. Afterward, she lay in his arms, looking into his eyes, her fingers idly smoothing the hair at his temple. "More?" she said hopefully. Liam burst out laughing and tightened his arms around her. "That is my favorite word, sweetheart." Chapter 28. In Zen, the city buzzed with afternoon activity as the summer sun asserted its presence. Cars filled the streets, their engines humming alongside the chatter of pedestrians bustling along the sidewalks. The heated sunlight bathed the buildings in a bright glow, casting long shadows that stretched across the pavement. People hurried about their day, some pausing to chat on street corners, others rushing into shops and offices. The city's rhythm pulsed under the clear blue sky, with occasional gusts of wind stirring leaves and lifting hats. And in one of the many skyscraper buildings in the city of Zen, one particular one stood out with a plaque that said, "Zen Field Office." Inside the building, the FBI office was spacious and filled with activity, with the sound of computers humming softly and agents talking quietly. Behind a large desk sat Special Agent William "Will" Parker, who looked focused as he reviewed a file. Will, in his early 30s, had an authoritative presence and took his work seriously. His office, typical of the FBI, had digital screens showing surveillance feeds and shelves neatly stacked with case files, showing his dedication to his job. Suddenly, the door burst open, and a young assistant rushed in, his breath hurried and eyes wide with urgency. Will's blue eyes, already narrowed in concentration, flashed a disapproving look at the interruption. "Sir Will, there has been a report about the murder of Alvin Thompson," the young assistant blurted out before Will could say anything. "A man called just now to say he can prove to us that Liam Thompson was responsible for murdering his stepbrother." Will sighed heavily, leaning back in his chair. Though an investigation into Alvin Thompson's death had previously been inconclusive, the suspicion against Liam Thompson was well known within the Bureau. But without solid evidence, they couldn't touch him, not after the Neil Weiner case had made authorities wary of premature arrests. Furthermore, Liam Thompson wasn't an ordinary man they'd just walk to and arrest because of some random stranger's call. Will wasn't ready to lose his job if things were to turn out like Neil Wayner's case. Who is the man who called? And what sort of evidence does this stranger claim to have against Liam Thompson? Will demanded, his voice measured but edged with skepticism. He didn't give his identity, but he sent this, the young assistant replied, handing over an iPad. I think you'll want to see it yourself. Will accepted the iPad with a resigned sigh. One of these days, I'll have to replace you for how you love to interrupt my breaks, he muttered good-naturedly, though the frustration lines on his forehead softened as he scrolled through the contents. Soon, his expression shifted from annoyance to genuine surprise and interest. He looked up at the young assistant, his eyes glinting with a hint of amusement and disbelief. For the first time in ages, you've brought something meaningful. Send my team to Liam Thompson's residence. We need him here at the office by tomorrow. The young assistant beamed with delight at the rare praise from Will. But he sobered up upon hearing what his boss said. Mr. Thompson is no longer in the city, he interjected, his expression serious. Last I heard, he's relocating to another country within a week. Will's frown deepened. Where is he now? I don't know his current location, but the informant mentioned we could track him through Rain Wallace. Standing on the balcony with his elbows propped on the wall, Liam watched the lights of a distant cruise ship sliding slowly northward as he waited for Rain to finish dressing up so they could leave for the casino he'd promised to take her inside the hotel building. After their first bout of lovemaking, they had gotten up to eat, then they had gone back to bed, made another crazy, intense love again, and fallen into a deep, exhausted slumber holding each other. The sun had already set when he woke up with Rain in his arms. He had felt utterly contented and totally relaxed lying there, and he still felt the same way now as he waited for her to finish getting ready. In the past, whenever he took a woman to bed, he never felt as contented as he felt now. He always had the urge to take another woman just so he could feel satisfied, but this time. I'm sorry I took so long, she said behind him, interrupting his thoughts. Liam straightened and turned, his relaxed smile widening into an appreciative grin as he took in the sight of her. Dressed in a short-sleeve black bodycon knee-length dress that hugged her body in the right places and emphasized her tiny waist, with sassy black high heels, Rain Wallace was a vision of lush curves, luminous skin, luxuriant hair, and smooth, long legs. His gaze riveted on her legs again, and Liam tipped his head back, grinning at his astonished reaction to what was, very possibly, the most beautiful pair of legs he'd ever seen. Are you grinning because I look nice? Or because there's something wrong with my dress, she teased, but she sounded a little anxious and unsure. I'm smiling because I just realized you have gorgeous, sexy legs, Liam replied wryly, and I never saw them before. I was wearing both of them earlier, she deadpanned. In fact, I clearly remember that they were attached to me when we were in bed. I was too close to get a full-length look when we were in bed. He winked at her. She rolled her eyes and walked up to him and turned her back. Would you pull my zipper up the last inch? She asked, lifting her hair out of the way for him. I can't reach it. Liam had performed that same service for other women countless times in the past, but as he looked down at Rain's exposed nape, there was an intimacy and pleasure associated with the simple act of pulling her zipper that surprised him. As he located the tab of the zipper and slid it up, she joked with him about his reaction to her legs. Let me guess, she said. You're one of those men who like legs, a leg man, right? Normally, Liam would have answered, yes, without hesitation or thought, but for some obscure reason, the question seemed all wrong, especially coming from her. Curving his hands around her shoulder and waist from behind, he bent his head and kissed her cheek. Let's not have that conversation, he whispered. Rain slowly turned around and looked at him. He hadn't answered the question for the same reason she'd instantly regretted asking it. She didn't want to know what female body parts he liked the most. In fact, right now, she wanted to think he was partial to her as a whole being. Nice answer, she said, smiling into his eyes. I thought so, too. He grinned and then, without warning, leaned down and captured her lips for a quick kiss that transformed into a hungry one. He knew he would never be able to get enough of her, and the more he kissed her, the more addictive she became. He liked kissing her. In fact, he liked her response to his kisses and touch. She melted into his kiss like liquid and moaned into his mouth as he closed his teeth lightly on her bottom lip and used his tongue to soothe it. He smiled into the kiss as Rain's arms went around his neck and parted her lips for him. His tongue plunged deep into her mouth and stroked every inch of her as his hand went behind her to pull her more tightly to his rigid thighs. Desire was beginning to rage and burn his blood to the extent that he was tempted to cancel their night outing and go back to bed with her, but he'd already promised to take her out tonight. Thus, he reluctantly tore his mouth from hers and grinned to himself when she moaned in protest and tried to kiss him again. Using his thumb to caress her slightly swollen lips, he whispered, "That's enough for now, little red." He pecked her lips one last time because he couldn't help it, then wrapped his arm around her waist and began to lead her towards the door before he changed his mind about going to the casino. Chapter 29. The casino he took her to was only a few miles from the hotel, and it was a large private club where the members spoke an amazing variety of foreign languages, and the table limits were very high because he'd taken her to the VIP section where it was obvious it was meant for wealthy men to place their bets. On the way there, Liam had described the casino as wealthy man's paradise, which Rain now realized translated into an atmosphere that was elegant, sophisticated, and subdued. It was an atmosphere that suited him perfectly, Rain thought. Wearing an impeccably tailored navy blue suit, dark gray shirt, and pale navy blue tie, he personified elegant sophistication and calm self-assurance. The only resemblance between the casinos she'd been to in the past and this one was that gambling was legal in both. In fact, the only times she'd ever seen casinos like this were in movies, and she'd never imagined herself to be in one like this. Trying not to look as if she'd never been inside a place like this, or been around people like this, Rain glanced past baccarat and roulette tables populated by wealthy men with large stacks of chips in front of them and well-kept women with glittering jewels at their wrists and throats. "Are you looking for something in particular?" Liam asked. "Yes," Rain replied, flashing him a laughing look, Tom Cruise. "You'll have to settle for me tonight." "I can do that," she replied unhesitatingly, and he grinned. "My original question referred to what game you prefer," Liam explained, suppressing the impulse to put his arm around her as they walked so the men staring at her would know who she belonged to. "I prefer whatever game I can win money playing." "In that case, we need to leave now," he joked. "Don't underestimate me, I'm very lucky at cards," she said with her chin up. Liam grinned as he found her cute. "How is your luck at blackjack?" "It depends." "Then blackjack it is." He smiled. They found 2 seats together at a blackjack table, and although Rain inwardly shuddered at the $1,000 minimum, she opened her purse and resolutely withdrew her prepaid travel card before she sat down. "I need to withdraw $5,000 from this first to cash out." "I intended to back you or I wouldn't have brought you here," Liam pointed out when she brought out her own card, while looking around for an ATM machine. "I can't gamble with your money. One of the things my father taught me was that a lady always gambles with her own money, or she doesn't gamble at all." "Your father seemed to be a very interesting man," Liam replied dryly as she turned and walked away, heading toward the ATM machine nearby. With an unconscious smile, he watched her walk, admiring her natural grace and the way her flame-colored hair changed from waves into thick curls below her shoulders. "Belladonna," the man on Liam's right remarked, his gaze also following Rain. "Yes, she is," Liam replied. He signaled to the dealer and filled out the usual form to withdraw money using his line of credit. "Make sure the young lady doesn't run out of chips when she needs more," Liam instructed the dealer as he began gathering his chips. "Of course, Mr. Thompson." An hour later, Rain was $4,400 ahead, and Liam had stopped playing to watch Rain play her hand. It was clear from the start that she knew when to take another card, when to keep the cards she had, and when to double her bet. When she followed the standard strategy, she won a lot. What intrigued him even more was that sometimes, on a hunch, she would do the opposite of what was expected, and still win. Unfortunately, her intuitive decisions made it difficult for the other players to predict her actions, causing them to make mistakes with their own hands. Liam wondered if she realized this when she pushed her chips towards the dealer and said, "I'd like to cash these in, please." Then she turned to the 4 men at the table and added politely, "I apologize if my decisions disrupted your game. It's hard for me to ignore my instincts once I have them." The Italian man who had spoken to Liam earlier grinned broadly at her, lifted her hand, and kissed it in sheer gratitude. "Una donna bellissima e direi qualsiasi cosa per portarla via da te," he exclaimed to Liam. Caught between surprise and disbelief at the man's actions, Rain gathered up her winnings while the man spoke animatedly in Italian to Liam, whose face hardened. His voice was subtly cold as he replied to the man in Italian, his expression telling Rain that he wasn't pleased with whatever the man said. "What was that all about?" Rain asked as they walked away from the puzzled man. "He noticed that you're not only very beautiful, but you are also very lucky at blackjack. He said more than that. He asked you a question, too, because you shook your head and answered him in a rather chilly voice." Liam grinned at her. "Did I sound chilly? That was rude of me then, and I'm rarely rude." "What did he ask you?" Rain persevered. "He asked if I would be willing to share you with him so that he would have not only the benefit of your body, but also, perhaps, your good fortune at cards." Rain snorted in disgust and shook her head. "He's an old lech, and I'm disgusted by his kiss." Liam's shoulders shook with laughter at her words, and he suppressed another strong urge, the urge to snatch her up into his arms and indulge in a public display of affection. "What did you say to him then?" It's difficult to translate it in English accurately. Give it a try. Loosely translated, I told him that he's an old lech, and that you're disgusted by his kiss. Rain laughed, but she wasn't buying it. "That's not what you said." Liam bent his head and whispered against her cheek. "I told the lech to get his own woman because I wasn't going to share mine with him." Then he straightened and continued walking as if having his lips on her cheek had been the farthest thing from his mind. Rain's heart did a somersault at hearing Liam refer to her as his woman, but she knew it was just a figure of speech, and she tried not to think it meant anything else. She had a wonderful time for the rest of the evening, even though she lost half her winnings. Liam gambled with the same effortless competence with which he did everything else, but what particularly fascinated Rain was his reaction to several women who made frank, obvious seductive gestures to him during the evening. He had no reaction. He simply acted as if the women were invisible without sparing any of them a second glance. Either he was so accustomed to it that he didn't notice, or else he didn't enjoy being looked at like a delicious sexual feast. Rain preferred to think the latter was true. Shortly after midnight, when they'd finished gambling, they stopped in an intimate little restaurant on the first floor of the casino, where a young, beautiful singer was singing on the platform with a guitar in hand. They found an empty table, and while the singer, with her beautiful voice, launched into the familiar lyrics of "All of Me," Rain watched Liam sit down, unbutton his jacket, lean back in his chair, and casually stretch his long legs out. That picture of him, relaxed, handsome, and utterly at ease in an exclusive private casino, imprinted itself on Rain's heart while the words to the song entwined around his image, framing it. Trying to hide her admiring smile, she put her elbows on the table and leaned her chin downward on her folded hands, watching him from beneath her lashes. A moment later, he evidently felt that a waiter should have already arrived, so he lifted his head an inch and glanced to his right with a trace of a frown. Two female waiters materialized from opposite directions, almost colliding with each other in their haste to answer his summons, and Rain muffled a smile with a little clearing of her throat. In her father's restaurant, she'd seen and witnessed how female waiters go crazy at the sight of a handsome man, but she'd never seen them look so obvious. But then, she didn't blame them, not when she herself was smitten by him. "How does white wine sound?" he asked while the waiter stood beside him. "Fine, thank you," Rain said, knowing she'd have only a sip. Still amused by her observations, she turned her head, watching the singer, a smile hovering at her lips. Liam ordered their drinks and then mistook the reason for her smile. "Are you especially fond of that song?" Rain nodded. "Of course." Feeling a little self-conscious because she could feel his eyes on her, Rain glanced down at the table and realized his hand was resting beside hers, less than an inch away. The sight of his long fingers lying so close to hers enthralled her and did crazy things to her innocent heart. Telling herself that she was being naive and foolish, she finally pulled her gaze away. Liam's head was bent, his gaze fixed intently on their hands, just as hers had been. Slowly, he lifted his hand, and then he laid it over hers. Rain felt a thrill run through her entire body. Swallowing, she watched to see if he had any noticeable reaction at all. He tightened his grip on her hand and interlocked their fingers together. Chapter 30. A few hours later. Scanning the surface of the water for a sign of Liam, Rain absently brushed sand off her legs and reached for one of the robes they'd brought from their room. The night was balmy, but she was beginning to shiver in her wet bathing suit, more from alarm than cold. When they left the casino, Liam had offered to take her to the mall so she could spend her winnings in one of the high-fashion boutiques that stayed open late to cater to the nightclub and casino crowd. He'd said she'd like the clothes and designs in the boutique, but Rain had suggested they go back to the hotel and go swimming instead. The last thing she wanted was Liam paying for her shopping, and from what she'd noticed, he never argued with her when she refused to use his money for something. He simply went behind her back and paid. Since he was so persistent about taking her night shopping with the excuse of her using her winnings, she'd convinced him to go for a swim instead. In her mind, she'd envisioned lazily floating in 4 feet of soothing salt water for half an hour. They'd done that, but when Rain was ready to get out, Liam said he was going to swim a little longer for some exercise. As she discovered as soon as he kicked off, when Liam swam for exercise, he did it with fierce force, driving his body through the water at maximum speed, as if demons were closing in on him. At first, Rain watched him in admiration, but a few minutes after she lost sight of him in the water completely, she began to worry about his safety. Trying not to let her concern escalate to panic, Rain continued to search the moonlit water as she shoved her arms into the sleeves of her robe and tied the belt. Finally, she made out a speck on the surface and sank onto a lounge chair, weak with relief. Freed at last of her worry about Liam, she drew her knees up to her chest and wrapped her arms around them. Tipping her head back, she gazed at the black night sky filled with shimmering stars while a profound sense of awareness swept over her. In a few days, she would go back to her old life where her days were all about the restaurant and how to keep it going. Not to mention Max, she hadn't heard from him today yet. She needed to get a strong hold of herself before she returned to Zen. Though she'd allowed herself a whole day of enjoyment with Liam, she didn't know what would happen tomorrow, and she did not want to think of it now. Not yet. Finally, she brushed away all those thoughts and glanced at the water to check on Liam. He was swimming in a straight line directly toward her, his shoulders and arms visible above the surface. In that moment, she suddenly understood. This was meant to be. They were meant to be. That's why she'd felt such an indescribable sense of magical closeness with him yesterday. But then, what sort of relationship did they have now? Liam's words earlier in the day came back to her. He'd said, "Let's get involved." Did that mean they were now in a relationship? Rain dismissed the thoughts yet again as she saw Liam stand up in the water. Raking his hands through the sides of his hair, he waded out of the sea with water streaming from his powerful shoulders and long legs, his dark swimming trunks clinging to his muscular thighs. He was so outrageously handsome that Rain shook her head. Smiling, she glanced back up at the stars and silently said, "What on earth were you thinking when you decided I deserved someone this good-looking?" Liam reached for the towel she held out to him and suppressed the urge to rumple the springy wet curls framing her face and tumbling over her shoulders. With her hair like that, she looked delectable. In fact, she looked exactly the way she had when he met her in the restaurant yesterday. "Hi," he said with a smile. She smiled back at him. "How was China? Did you pass any sharks on the way there?" Grinning at her sarcasm, Liam started toweling off his chest and arms. "I've been lazing around down here for a week," he explained. "I needed the exercise." "Do you normally swim for exercise?" He shook his head. "I have a gym back home, you know. I only swam for exercise when I was in the camp with Neil," he said as he reached out and wrapped his arm around her waist to pull her closer. She gasped in shock as her breast collided with his solid chest, and before she could react, his mouth was on hers. "Let's go back inside," he whispered breathlessly as he pulled away from the kiss. His hands slid away from her waist and found her hand. He interlocked their fingers, something Rain noticed he liked to do. Propped up naked in bed with Liam's arm around her, Rain watched the night sky giving way to dawn. When they'd returned from swimming, they'd showered and then discovered they were famished. The remnants of their shared feast were on the coffee table, and they ate together. Afterward, they went to bed, but sleep was not what Liam had in mind. The fierce, demanding urgency and relaxed playfulness of his earlier lovemaking were gone. This time, he made love to her with slow, torrid sensuality, driving her steadily toward a final climactic destination while detouring on previously unexplored erotic routes to get her there, whispering directions and encouragements that were as arousing to Rain as the things he was doing with her. By the time he finally let her finish, Rain was writhing wildly in his arms, frantically whispering, "Please," over and over. When the last spasm had shaken her, he changed the tempo of his strokes, and Rain's limp body suddenly arched up like a tightly strung bow, straining toward him of its own volition while he poured himself into her. Rain heard herself moan, and she clung to him, caught up in a moment that was not only wildly sexual but almost fiercely spiritual. Later on, when she looked back on it all, she might have seen herself as a naive student who'd just been tutored by a skilled, perhaps less involved master, except that afterward, he'd gathered her against his full length and kept their bodies clamped tightly together with his face buried in the curve of her neck for a very long time, as if he'd been profoundly affected by their lovemaking too. Even now, as they watched the sunrise through the glass wall, his hand was curved around her arm, his thumb caressing her skin. They were both drowsy, the periods of silence between them growing longer, but as the sky continued to lighten, the dawn of a new day was banishing Rain's quiet happiness and filling her with worry and fresh guilt about Max. She had waited to return his phone call yesterday until she was getting dressed for the casino because she knew Max would be hanging out with his friends by then. She'd left him a voicemail message assuring him that she wasn't at all angry with him, that she was having a lovely time visiting neighboring islands, and that there was absolutely no need for him to worry or feel guilty about anything. Everything she told him was true, but the things she did not tell him made her message a tawdry, unforgivable deception. On the other hand, she couldn't possibly break up with him by phone, not after the years they'd been together, and especially not after he'd just brought up marriage. There were only a few days left of their planned 10-day trip. If his business issues dragged on another day or two, he'd surely decide there was no point in flying back down to the island. Sensing her change in mood, Liam glanced at the woman who was responsible for the most exhilarating, fulfilling sexual experience of his life. Her red curls were in wild disarray, tumbling over her shoulders and the tops of her naked breasts, and her porcelain cheeks were still slightly flushed from their lovemaking, but her expression had turned very thoughtful. Liam assumed she was probably thinking about her boyfriend and wondering whether he was going to arrive that day. He'd been thinking about the same thing, too. Troubling thoughts, he whispered. She turned her head on the pillow. Not really, not about you, anyway, she amended. After a moment, she smiled and said, "Can I ask you something?" He nodded. "Those times when the media used to spread rumors about your relationships with different women, were you really in love with them?" Ordinarily, that question in this particular situation would have evoked a wary reaction in Liam, but they had been lying there asking each other casual questions off and on since they finished making love. They were, after all, two people who had intimate carnal knowledge of each other, and they had feelings for each other, but they had no facts. And since they had already traded information about favorite movies, favorite foods, least favorite politicians, and so forth, her question seemed perfectly reasonable to Liam. "No, but they believed I was," he explained. "When I take a woman, I take her for one reason, and I make it clear to them that I don't want to get emotionally involved, but they still harbor the thought that I love them." Rain felt her heart knot. She wanted to ask him about her. How did he feel about her, and if she was just like any of those women? But she didn't want to come across as desperate or clingy, so she fell silent. She sought an innocuous question to ask and, after a moment, decided to ask about the tiny scar on his chest. "Where did you get this scar?" she asked, touching it with her fingers. Liam had gotten the scar when he was caught in bed with a married woman years ago when he was still insensitively young and naive. He had been beaten senseless by the man's bodyguards. He could never forget that night. He had just turned 20, and the woman had seduced him into going to bed with her while assuring him that her husband wouldn't be coming back anytime soon. But who would have thought the man would be back that night? However, he wasn't going to share such an embarrassing story with Rain, not when she was all he needed right now in his life. "I got it somewhere in the military," he lied with a straight face. Then after a moment of silence, while Rain was silently tracing her finger around the scar, he spoke up again. "You never mention your mother," Liam asked. "What happened to her?" Lifting her brows, Rain said, "You never mention your mother either." "Is she alive?" Liam persisted. "I refuse to tell you unless you tell me about yours first." "I think you'll tell me anyway. You couldn't pry it out of me with a weapon." "I can pry it out of you with 2 fingers, he promised with absolute certainty, sliding his hand under the sheet to seek out her legs. "Don't you dare," Rain warned, clamping her legs together. Suddenly it was important that he not be able to keep his secrets while manipulating her so easily into telling hers. His fingers slid through the triangle at her thighs. "Open your legs, Rain." "No." It hit her when his hands began tracing her thigh that her logic was totally wrong and that she was silly to resist. She relaxed the tension in her legs, gasping when he slid one finger deep inside of her and rubbed his thumb against her sensitive areas. Then she relaxed and let him spread pleasure and warmth through her. "Is there something you want to tell me?" he asked, slowly increasing the pressure and altering the movements of his fingers. "No," Rain whispered faintly, putting her arms around his shoulders and closing her eyes. He was getting her so close she could barely stop herself from moving with him. "Isn't there something you want to tell me now, Little Red?" She was clinging to him, her heart racing, her nails digging into his back. "No," she gasped, but her body was on the verge of convulsing. He stopped. "How about now?" She was hanging on a cliff, desperate, and he knew it. He'd intended to deprive her of a climax just when she was on the verge and withhold it from her until she yielded. Somehow she'd mistakenly thought he believed he could get an answer out of her by giving her pleasure, while he intended to do it by depriving her of pleasure. Her body was begging her to give in. Her heart wouldn't let her. She let go of his shoulders and dropped back onto the pillows, looking up at him with wounded eyes, silent and disappointed. He stared back at her, his black eyes heavy-lidded, his expression unreadable. Suddenly, he scooped her into his arms, his fingers seeking the same places he'd touched and left, driving her all the way to the climax he'd deprived her of before. Rain clung to him while shudders shook through her, and when they passed, she lay back on the pillows and lifted her hand, sliding it across his hard jaw, tenderly smoothing back his thick black hair. "My parents got divorced years ago, before I graduated from Ivy Grove. My mom lives in Mirage Mesa with her new husband," she whispered, conceding victory to him, but a victory that was won on her terms, not his. Liam felt unfamiliar emotions swelling in his chest. He realized she was meant for him, they were meant for each other. But later today or tomorrow, another man would come for her, a man who had more right to her than Liam did. In his mind, Liam heard trumpets and heralds calling his name, summoning him to the arena of commitments. He imagined himself like a gladiator, without weapons or armor, armed only with his secrets and fragile hopes. The horns were already blaring, and he was walking toward his fate, defenseless but fearless. Rain's hand rested against his cheek, her fingers gently caressing his jaw while her green eyes beckoned him. Smiling, Liam turned his face into her hand, kissed her palm, and whispered, "For whatever lies ahead, I am prepared."